But, she also may decide not to wear it, after all. Osrith's mind filled with Alba, and Constantine and Domnall. Was he king of all Alba now? Was Eochaid executed? What of Giric? Osrith found tagged in the stables, mucking out again. As Osrith pushed through the wooden doors, which creaked, he looked up, pausing from moving the clean straw into place. There is to be a service for the battle. Will you be there? Osrith enthused. Tagged said nothing. Fergus, who was up in the hay loft, climbed down the ladder. Yes, we are to parade with the guards of the fortress. There is to be a Thanksgiving service, Osrith continued, noticing there was none of her own enthusiasm at the prospect of returning to Alba in her comrades. Do you know, the king visited me in the scriptorium and gave me a dress to wear. Right. Tagged glanced at Osrith, a strange tone to his voice. Osrith made to reach for his arm, then stopped. She saw their blankets had been bundled into parcels. Back to Alba? To Domnall? Osrith was astonished as Tagged nodded. A swell of happiness arose in her stomach. It would be absolutely fine sailing presently, though it was winter the weather was fine, and they could reach Dund as easily as when they left it. Osrith wondered whether Grioghair was coming with them, or remaining with the king. She watched Tagged sweep out the old straw, the thought soared again. This was her mother's land, a hybrid of the original Christian heathens following Pelagic and the Irish Church, which just overlaid Christianity onto the heathen beliefs, and the new Augustine Christianity. And, their city was, by and large, protected by the old one left behind by the Latins now to be ruled by a Dane. It worked. Osrith loved it. But now they were returning to their king. I will be with you at the feast, Osrith continued. Tagged said nothing, but nodded, continuing to work. She glanced down at his hands which she longed to embrace with her own. She dared not look at his lips, for on these too, she wished to press her mouth. And at Dunnottar. Do as you wish, Osrith. Tagged snapped back, so suddenly that Fergus dropped his sword belt. Later, then. She nodded, later Fergus, she added, then turned, crossing the courtyard and back to the scriptorium, not unseen by a watching figure. Put it out of your mind, she told herself, as the stairs to the top of the scriptorium creaked under her leather boot. Wear this dress, stand beside the king. Then, feast with the warriors and leave for Alba? What did Tagged have to be so cross about? Half came that afternoon, bringing a tub of water and a cloth. She smiled, nervously at Osrith, asking her to undress so she could bathe her. I will, Osrith said, taking the cloth and the water. Took care to lock the door, carefully taking buée and laying her sword on her cloak. She stood in the evening coolness and proceeded to unclothe, dipping the cloth into the water and wringing it out. She caught Half's expression as the Briton looked at her. You are a woman then? Osrith nodded. But you fight? She pressed, her small voice insistent. Women can fight, women do fight. She smiled at the girl's expression. And you will marry Galman now? I will, she said, handing Osrith a dry cloth, opening the back of the dress by drawing out the cord as Osrith patted herself dry. Then, Osrith's mind really saw the gift she had been given. Silk would show every crease, so she allowed Half to stand on a chair and glide the fabric over her body. The young girl pulled in the dress and it took Osrith's form. It was a little tight over her breasts and hips, maybe she had been eating too much and been inside too much, and not enough fighting practice. They were to go home to Nai, and it would not take long to regain her strength. After Half had arranged her dress, she took a comb from her apron and smoothed it through Osrith's hair before arranging with a piece of the silk tied into her now jaw-length hair, reminding Osrith of Malmuir, as she dressed before the fair at Dara. The king was waiting for Osrith at the bottom of the scriptorium tower. Half helped her down each step and opened the heavy oak door. Guthred held out a hand, which Osrith took. It was soft and Guthred smiled when he closed his around Osrith's. You look beautiful. His words were soft, only for her and, despite the pageantry, Osrith smiled. Then she saw the procession. Every person in Caeligwylid seemed to be standing, waiting to cross into the service, and she was aware many eyes were on her. She looked behind her, trying to find Tagged and Fergus. They were leaving tonight, Osrith reminded herself. She just had to stand, sit, pray beside King Guthred, and they would be soon rowing with the flow of the Adun. Next to the priests, St. Cuthbert's casket was high up on the shoulders of its bearers, and they crossed, solemnly, to the candlelit monastery church. Guthred escorted Osrith to a large, oak-carved bench, close to the altar. Osrith sat, her eyes switching between Abbot True and Cuthbert, who lived so long ago and, for a man who heard God most clearly on a remote, bird-inhabited island, might well have considered his journey throughout Northumbria to avoid the Norse ironic indeed. Osrith sat and listened, and prayed, as True and the monks carried through the rites. Once or twice, she looked over her shoulder to catch Tagged's eye, but the warrior was looking at the floor. Behind him, the Norseman she had fought to save Guthred was looking at her, at the coffin of St. Cuthbert, at the monks, at the king. It was as if he had never been in a church before, and perhaps he hadn't. His blonde hair was bound into a cord at the back of his skull, small wisps moved with the currents of candlelight. He was bound, humiliated. Yet, he would not take his eyes off Osrith. She turned back, thinking of the feast. She could drink, she knew Tagged would, then maybe, she could make her way with him up to the hayloft rather than the scriptorium tower. If it did not come off, she could blame the ale. Osrith felt a blush on her cheeks as she thought of his hands on her body, and forced herself to dash them quickly. She was in church, for heaven's sake, in the presence of blessed Cuthbert. So, she closed her eyes, and prayed for the king, the kingdom, and to be free of enemies. And for Domhnall, that he was alive, and prospering. It was only when a hand touched hers that Osrith realized the service was over. It was the king who had touched her so lightly, and she put it into his, which was outstretched as she opened them. The warriors, including Tagged and Fergus, had left, as too had Cuthbert. But several monks remained, and some of the guards. "My dear, you look radiant." Guthred took a small bow, as Osrith rose. "Come, kneel with me, before the feast." Before the altar they knelt. What were they praying for? Osrith wondered. A figure appeared, near the back of the church, indistinct and only for a second. Kevin was holding one of the altar candles, and he stepped a little closer to Osrith, his face beaming. "Well," he began, in his usual outpouring of words, "now you know." He grinned wider. "I would have told you, bound to have done, if I had not gone to matins this morning." Osrith frowned. "No what?" But Kevin thought he was playing into a game with her, and withdrew a little. Before he could say anything, Guthred was standing by her, hand outstretched again. But, it was Abbot True who spoke. He was unsmiling, but held his robe cloth out to both Guthred and Osrith. "To the wedding of Guthred Harthknutson, King of Halligwithicland in Northumbria and the ward of the King of Alba, Domhnall, second of his name of the line Alpin, Osrith Lackland." He had won. Osrith listened to the sentence again in her mind. Domhnall now had the throne at Dunotter. The church was silent, as if waiting for Osrith to say something. Beyond the window, on the river, she saw Tagged, with Fergus, managing the coracle. Yes, she thought. Domhnall was king and they were leaving. We were leaving, her mind corrected herself. And the rest of the taffel pieces surrounded her. She glared at Guthred and yanked her hand away from his. True's cloth fluttered to the floor. "No!" Osrith shouted, backing away from the king. She stopped when she felt a point to her back. "Yes," growled a voice by her ear. It was Grioghair. She glanced at the river again, remembering what she had seen. There were only 2 crew in the coracle. She shifted uneasily under the point. "You think I would let Colleen's death go unpunished?" "No. This is fitting. You will be a queen, and Domhnall will have his alliance." "No." Osrith shouted as she stepped under duress back towards Guthred. The king was still smiling, but it was not as heartfelt as it had just been moments ago. "No. Lord King. Abbot." She looked between True and Guthred, and added with all the dignity she could muster, "I am already married." Guthred looked across to Griofare, alarm on his face. She is already married? Behind him, some of the servants paused in their tasks, listening. Osrith noticed that Eric Thurgilson was also staring at her. Tell me you have not wed Constantine. Abbot True exclaimed, a horrifying turn of politics playing out in his mind. A hedge marriage, your grace, nothing more. And here he scorned the word, husband, is gone. Grioghair moved his head towards Osrith. Though yourself and the young prince now ... I heard every moment of your night with him. In her chest, panic began to spread, like a wound unstemmed, spreading out throughout her. Where is my sword? Osrith demanded, recalling she had left it in the scriptorium. This one did NPT have the feel or weight of Buey. Where are my clothes? She began pulling at the dress, ignoring the laughter around her. Because, if she could get those, there was a good chance she could still catch up with the coracle. Grioghair grabbed at the back of the dress but Osrith ducked under his arm. The back cord dripped and suddenly, she was swamped in fabric. She pulled at the dress, to keep herself covered. I am sure we would all like to see you naked, Grioghair said, lunging for her again. But Osrith was too quick for him, and had swiftly drawn one of the guard's swords from its scabbard. She glanced at Guthred's face as she advanced on Grioghair, feeling a little stab of guilt. It was clear now her marriage to Guthred was the alliance, and Osrith suspected that Grioghair had swiftly used her as a bargaining piece to guarantee Guthred's alliance and risk his own forces to a prince who had yet to secure his kingdom. But, this time, and Osrith knocked Grioghair's blade from his hand with remarkable ease, Domnall was not going to get his alliance. He was now king, Guthred's alliance was irrelevant. I bound your hand, lady, True intoned, officiously. You are wed to King Guthred. He swept an arm in an arc and pointed to a monk, who was writing onto a parchment in a huge volume, no doubt taken from the very room Osrith had slept in. And, does it say Osrith Lackland? Osrith stood towards Abbot True, Grioghair still under blade. It says, Osrith Lackland, ward of Domnall II, King of Alba, the monk replied. It still sounded good to Osrith as calmed time. But that is not my name, Osrith cautioned. I am married, and my name is my husband's, Tagged of Doyaya. A smirk crossed Grioghair's face. He will be dead before he even gets to Alba. He scoffed. He returns with only half his crew, at midwinter, in the most treacherous of seas. He is Irish, Osrith continued. Keep it going, long enough to formulate the plan. And is it consummated? This time, Abbot True asked the question. What do you think? Osrith laughed, lying. Of course it is consummated, why else would we be hanged? And, she considered, she had it. So you wish that I wed another, and have two husbands? Osrith looked around at the people who remained in the church. She had noticed that many of the servants, even a few of the guards, were not Dane, Saxon nor Angle. She was of this country, the Old North. Bigamy was not tolerated within the British heathen faith, further, a woman's word was as equal to a man's. Osrith had read it in the scriptorium, read it amongst many things of her mother's homeland, and knew exactly what she needed to do. Politics was delicate in Cael-Iguilid, as in Cumbraland. The Saxons needed to hold on to the territory as it was nominally British, so tolerated their heathen practices, while the heathen, accepted Northumbria was their kingdom. I am sorry, Lord King, Osrith kept the blade of the warrior pointed at Grioghair. I claim the right to settle the dispute before the trade, she said, in Cymric. Will he, or she make themselves known? It took a few minutes anything happened. The Norseman moved in his chains, but no Dwight came forward. Then, in that case, Osrith continued, her options narrowing suddenly, I fight the king. This caused a stir. The monks behind True began to whisper. She plunged on, anger holding, refusing to let fear take its place. If I lose, then God, the gods, know I am false, my marriage is false and I will marry King Guthred. You are already married to the king. True shot back. If I win, I take this land, Eofic and Northumbria. You are? I am Northumbria. Osrith raised her voice, at the denials of validity. But, she could see the Cymri were on her side. It was a heathen religious method if settling a dispute, after all. Impossible. True declared. But Guthred was sweeping past Osrith, not looking at her, or indeed, anyone else. He paused, as if listening to something Eric was saying as he passed, then continued swiftly through the church door. Impossible! Shouted True again. Why? The voice came from the shadows. In the guttering candlelight stood the Northman. Why is it impossible? He glanced at Osrith. She offers fair rods. But the king, True continued. He is no longer here, said Eric, and, as I am here as a result of her skill, I offer to fight in my countryman's stead. Yes, Osrith agreed, nodding to Eric. It could very well be a trap. But she must take it. Abbot True looked at Grioghair. Secure her in the scriptorium, Grioghair said. But Osrith pressed the blade to his throat. Where? Grioghair asked. It is already dark. Here. Around them, seats were being drawn back. An area of bare oak planks were revealed. Yes, she could fight here. True. Are you mad? Grioghair asked, as Osrith assessed the ground. You cannot possibly accept this. She is the king's wife. Now it was Osrith's turn to smirk. She could win this, or she would never have prepared him. Shev had beaten the Norseman once before. Grioghair knew this. He knew, too, that it was his reputation that would be in ruins if he allowed it. But, as he was at the sharp end of Osrith's blade, he had little choice. I move, Abbot True continued, looking gravely at Grioghair, to speak for the king. Justice should be done. The outcome is God's will. He bowed his tonsured head. The proposal is sound. We should see how the queen defends the honor of her king. That wasn't what she said, and he knew it. Osrith made to clarify the point, but noticed that, already, the cords holding the Norseman fast were already loosening. Osrith made to steady her mind. Eric Thurgilson was standing in place of Guthred. He was Guthred in this fight. One of the guards handed him a sword, and he strode out to the cleared space in the center of the church. Osrith was about to raise her sword, but for a patter of small feet beside her. She turned. It was Half. May Belinos be with you. She whispered, under the cover that she was securing Osrith's torn dress. Osrith turned, kissing the girl on the cheek. Thank you. Half stepped back by her father who, Osrith noticed, was holding the girl's hand tightly. They were on her side, Osrith thought. She must not let them down. The Norseman could not be beaten on strength, for he was far stronger than Osrith. But, she was fleet, and though she felt a light-headed from the incense, she threw herself towards the Norseman, striking out with her inferior sword. There was a gasp as the blade caught him cleanly through the thigh and came away coated in crimson. But too late did she see the Northman's own sword, and her slowness was rewarded with agony as he used the flat of his sword to strike her chest. Osrith twisted toward him, but her leg buckled as he drove the blade towards her calf. He had kissed, and this time, she was quick enough to move away. Osrith landed heavily on one knee, still lashing out towards the hostage with her blade, flashing in the candlelight. And she could see what she needed to do. And thrust herself forward with more strength than she thought she had. Their blades clashed as Osrith went on the offensive. Neither had a shield, so they were using their swords to defend the blows. He was weaker than she expected, though he was fighting as if he had no injury to his leg. A figure darted to Osrith's right. Who that was, Osrith didn't know, but it was enough for the Norseman to catch her in the small of the back. He stabbed with the hilt, and Osrith fell heavily, the room passing before her eyes. This was the end now, Osrith thought. He had beaten her. And, more than that, he was avenging his defeat by actually slaughtering her. Somehow, though, Osrith managed to roll away. Blood, presumably from the Northman, was flowing onto the wooden floor. And, she got to her feet. Damn them. Anger began to flow through her. She had been parted from Tagd and Fergus, and her body was flabby. Weeks of little training was bearing out. She twisted up and was now behind the Northman, who had slipped on the blood, and she kicked his other ankle so that he slammed, chest first, onto the wooden floor. One more lunge brought down Eric. It was a foolish, childish move taught to her by Sainid, but it had worked. Then, she felt the pain in her hip, saw the blood absorbing into the cloth, the big gash down her thigh. Osrith tottered forward, her left arm clenched to her side. And then, she was falling towards the Northman and expected to fall heavily onto him. But was stopped in her tumble as a strong, protective arm wrapped around her chest and pulled her forcefully backwards into an embrace. She had won. The Northman was down, though the fight had been easy and swift. It was then that Osrith began to have doubts as Guthred, who had clearly witnessed God's decision, held fast to her. Osrith felt her heart beating. She refused to look at Guthred, however, and he loosened his grip of her as Eric Thurgilson staggered to his feet. "Do with her as you will," the king said, thrusting Osrith towards Grioghair, who grabbed her wrists tightly together. "My lord king." Abbot True started in Guthred's direction, and at Grioghair. "She is your wife. She is your queen. You are one. The annals declare it. When she learns to behave as one, we will see." Grioghair. Guthred turned. "My lord king," True exclaimed, scrambling past Eric, still lying on the floor, and out of the door. "Guards, remove the Norseman," he added, in his wake. "Do as I will." He looked Osrith, then barked orders to leave to the monk's servants and guards. "You will let me go?" Osrith demanded, but instead, Grioghair hauled Osrith by the arms behind the injured Northman, out of the church and into the icy courtyard. She struggled against Grioghair, who kicked the back of her legs. Osrith stumbled, and Grioghair caught her hair. She gritted her teeth in pain, as he pulled up her by it. "Have a good look," Grioghair shouted, pulling off the rest of the ruined dress so Osrith's frame shivered in her slip. "Queen of Cumberland." He dragged her by her hair, wielding a hand towards the prison door past the two guards for it to be unlocked, before throwing her into the dungeon, opposite the church. The Northman had already been returned to the cell and Grioghair pushed her inside too. She fell onto the straw as the metal lock clicked closed. "Your marriage to the king is legal," Grioghair spat. "Domhnall sanctioned it and Guthred will have you by his side." "I will not. I won my freedom, as well you know." Osrith spat back. But Grioghair had already left. She pulled herself to the bars, looking out, but could see little. Tiny pinpricks of light illuminated in the distance, which Osrith took to be candles, or the warriors' torches guarding the gates. She shivered. Very little remained of the dress, and no wonder the men had stared. The front was in ruins, her breasts, most of her stomach and her legs were bare. She folded her arms across herself, glaring into the darkness where she knew Eric Thurgilson. For the fight had been over quickly and such an experienced warrior had yielded suspiciously soon. "Why are you here?" the Northman said, after a few moments. The moon was gibbous and gave enough light to see the man's face. He seemed genuinely curious. "Because I wouldn't accept the king," Osrith replied. She shivered again. A bitter wind was building from the east, and she had mere scraps of a once spectacular gown hanging from her shoulders. Had Tagd known about this? It explained his mood that afternoon. If he'd been told she was to marry the king, they were Domhnall's men, they'd already lost Finolai AMD. Now she was here, prisoner of the Halligwithicland king. "But you won," the Northman pointed out. "Everyone saw it. Everyone saw it, but few will accept it. The abbot, the king, my own king's man will never honor it. And they say we are barbarians," Eric said, and winced as he spoke. But Osrith was too angry to care. "Why did you let me win?" she asked, bitterly. "I needed to have won. I need to be ruler of Northumbria." Eric scoffed. "You did win, girl. The injury you gave me at the battle was enough to slow me, and then you got my leg. There was no let you about it." The Northman moved on the cold straw beneath him. I am truly glad no kin of mine were there to see me. A clank of chains indicated the man was getting up. Do you need treatment? I have survived worse. I am a hostage, not a prisoner, though you might not know it. He took a few steps towards her, and Osrith backed away, suddenly as he came out to the moonlight. Looks like you have a few wounds yourself. Osrith pulled her clothing round her more, though they were inadequate against the cold. You speak English well. Osrith observed, ignoring his comment. I spent a long time in Neofuic. Osrith tried some Gaelish, and then Cymric. At both he looked blank. Not so much time in Strathclyde or Pitland or Alba, she baited him. No, indeed, the Northman replied, evenly at her dig. Why did you offer to fight me? Honor. If you have no honor you have nothing. At least now I know you are a warrior of honor, even though the rulers here do not. And what you said to Guthred. The Norseman paused. I merely reminded Guthred of his Danish line. Honor is our ace, not Christianity. Here. He passed her a thin cloak, Pearl's his own. Despite her anger, Osrith reached out for it, bundling it up around her. Thank you. What is thank you in Danish? Tak, said Erik Thurgilson. Tak, repeated Osrith. Then, she sat down in the straw, trying to get warm. The Northman clanked his chains close by. Osrith shuffled back, her hands outstretched. I will do nothing to you, the Northman said. You are a victorious warrior, cruelly treated. Though your body is desirable will not. Tak, Osrith said again, hinching down to a cold night. After a time, when the Northman, too, settled at the other side of the cell, he spoke. Are you really married? Or did you lie to the king? I'm married, Osrith nodded. To one of those Scottish warriors who left tonight, I'm guessing. Yes. Osrith looked down, in the darkness. Her love for Tagged, different from her attachment to Constantine or her bond to Domhnall, was all-encompassing. He filled her senses, filled her mind. She would be with him, heart and soul. And she was beginning to care not they were comrades. Osrith desired him, and she could be with him, were she just to escape. I must get away, she murmured, as she tried to close her eyes. How had it come to this? This morning, she was gazing down to Tagged, to the Cymry beyond the walls. None will know of this, a voice murmured across from Osrith. She opened her eyes. Monks were there. They would have written it in the annals of Cumbraland. News of my so-called marriage, and our fight will be sent out to the kingdoms. The Northman let put a big sigh. Are you being truthful? Sadly, yes, Osrith nodded. Then Siegfried, my brother, may yet hear of me. Osrith's eyes brightened. Not if we escape. We cannot escape from here, I have tried. Osrith shivered again, despite Eric's cloak. Where were Tagged and Fergus tonight? Along the coast? What would happen when they reached Domhnall? Her mind fixed on Tagged. He had told her not to trust him. And now he was king. But, no. Unless Domhnall told her to her face, she would never believe it. No, Osrith was sure, this was Griog's scheme. He knew so much about her, even the name Lackland that she had given herself. Some while later, after the moon set, and the place was inky black, Eric's voice came to her ears. It was then that Osrith realized she had been asleep. You did win, warrior. Osrith. You did win, Osrith, he said again. You are not meant to be married to this king. I am not meant to be imprisoned with no sword, no means to serve my lord. You are a woman, he added. I am a warrior. Osrith retorted. I meant no offense. Norse and Danish women are often warriors. You fight with skill and courage. Tak, Osrith replied. The next time Osrith was woken that night was for a tiny chink sound of the lock of the cell to open. Osrith listened, and heard a light thud near the gate. Who was there? And in the morning, she found her own a thick, woolen cloak folded neatly and placed carefully near her feet.